I look back, people always say, like, who really influenced you? And they usually ask that question thinking it's going to be something positive, like you emulate something positive. This person was everything I didn't want to become as a manager. You seem pretty relaxed right now. And he's like, actually, I'm pretty stressed out. This financial crisis is very serious. My job as a leader is to have you not feel that. Like, my job is to have you feel confident. Time that India played Pakistan, people aren't going to be paying attention to work anyway. You guys, everybody go home and let's watch the match. We shouldn't be happy with 20 to 33. We should be like, why can't we be 500? Don't take the safe route all the time because it's a kind of a limiting route.
So ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, depending on where you are joining us from for this very special episode of Towards a Better World on a Thinkly platform that hosts curated content from leading thinkers of our contemporary world. My name is Ayon Banerjee, and this is a platform where I invite inspirational people from all walks of life. Like always, I insert a disclaimer here that I do this on a personal capacity and my podcasts are not reflective of my day job. Today's episode is extremely special for me as our guest happens to be not just my own professional mentor and role model, but someone who inspires thousands in the business world across industries and geographies. Yes, I am talking of Mr. John Flannery, the former CEO and the 10th chairman of General Electric Company. In his amazing and rich 3-decade career at GE, John has led several mission-critical assignments, which we'll touch upon, of course. But what excites me the most about today's show is that we'll get this opportunity to understand John Flannery in person and his approach to leadership. Please feel free to drop your questions and we'll try to keep the last 15 minutes for Q&A. So now, without further ado, let me welcome John. Thank you, John. Thanks for taking time out from your busy schedule to talk to us. Thank you very much.
And I'm super happy to be here. So I look forward to our conversation today.
Absolutely, John. Thank you so much. It's a great privilege for me to have you here because, there have been so many people have been saying that we wish we could get an opportunity to listen to John. And especially your old G troops. So it will be a great session, of course. And let me begin, John. Let me dive into it by a quote, by quoting from one of the quotes of the iconic and late Jack Welch. And we just spoke about him a few minutes back, John, when we were off stage. So, Welch had said that before you become a leader, success is all about growing yourself. But after you become a leader, it is all about growing others. Now, you have had an incredibly inspiring career, John. And while we'll dig deeper into your journey itself, I'd like to request on behalf of our audience, and also it's a personal curiosity of mine, about your page one. Because I always feel that a great career kicks off at a certain moment. It could be an assignment, an event, or perhaps another individual who inspires us and gets us started on something that would go and take us beyond a mere day job. And we just spoke about it, John, and I'm sure that you will elaborate on that. And I ask this because I know that you used to be a big believer in growing more leaders. But these days, unfortunately, we see this intent diminishing, in organizations as well as in leaders. That is this drive to pick and back talent like it used to be till about 10 years back. So this is a two-part question, John. What was or when was your page one? And then what is your advice to leaders about growing more leaders?
That's a great question, and Jack had a knack for simplifying things, and I'll talk about his quote in a second. But I guess I'm sort of two dimensions to this question. One are certain roles I had that kind of got the ball rolling, if you will, and one is people and mentors and people that I observed along the way. And then I'll have a quick comment about your Jack quote at the end. But I always, tell people one of the funny parts of my GE career is I barely got into GE at all. The very first interview of my life was with GE. I was graduating from college. GE had the FMP program, financial management program. I interviewed for that. I did a terrible job. I did not get hired. So that's strike one at GE. Then I'm in business school, and I know there's a certain part of GE Capital that was interviewing that I wanted to join. They come to campus. And it turned out to be somebody interviewing for a job in Dallas, Texas only. And I was like, I can't go to Dallas, Texas, but please, please, can you introduce me to someone in New York? And that was like 5 minutes with that person. And somehow they actually sent my, CV into New York. And so I barely got into GE period paragraph. So some of the stuff is luck. But the couple of roles that I'd say were along the way where I felt like my career is sort of changing, or maybe the aperture of what I could ultimately experience was changing. The first was my first overseas assignment. We moved to Argentina in 1997 when I was in GE Capital. And that was the first time where I would just say my self-confidence started to grow. That was a job where I had basically a desk and a phone, and I had to learn the language. Like, that was my starting point. So I didn't have really anything to build on other than GE was on my business card, which was helpful. But when I came out of that job, I was a different person, in terms of self-confidence, a little more worldly, et cetera. And then as you and I have been talking, the India job for me was another step function, sort of, where I'm like, this is a whole different equation. It's a different part of GE. And, it was another tick up, I'd say, in confidence. And part of being a leader is the right mix of humility and confidence. And you really need both. And then early on, I'd say that, there were sort of two things on the people side of things. I had a manager when I was about 30, 32, who was very difficult. And, so I look back, people always say, like, who really influenced you? And they usually ask that question thinking it's going to be something positive, like you emulate something positive. And this person was everything I didn't want to become as a manager, very volatile. One day, super happy. One day, very negative. The organization sort of fluctuating. Everybody kind of uneasy around them, et cetera. And at that time, I was like, this is not fun working for this person, and I don't want to turn out like this person as a leader. So I actually learned a lot from a challenging leader. And then I worked for guys like Mike Neal and Dennis Naden. They were GE Capital CEOs, and they just got me going on building the team, delegating authority, having a positive attitude. I went through the financial crisis with Mike Neal in 2008, and he never blinked. He never, and I remember talking to him at one point saying, "Hey, you seem pretty relaxed right now." And he's like, "Actually, I'm pretty stressed out. This financial crisis is very serious." He and I were friends, by this point. He was my boss, but we were good friends. And he's like, "My job as a leader, if you knew everything that was going on in my head, you would be terrified. My job as a leader is to have you not feel that. Like, my job is to have you feel confident." And, I carried that into the rest of my career. And then lastly, just on the Jack front, that quote about, all about yourself converting into all about the rest is it's the singular thing when I talk about careers in GE, when I look back at my own career, when I think about, sort of multiplying the impact of yourself. The first 30 years of our lives is all individual. Study hard, get good grades. Good grades get you a good school. Good school gets you a good job. For a while, your job is sole contributor, et cetera. You're self-propelled for a long time. And then you get to certain roles where it becomes bigger than that. And you're really dependent on the team. You get, I used to say, like, your score now is the weighted average of the score of your team. If you have C players, you're a C player. If you have A players, you're an A player. And the sooner people accepted that basic algorithm, the more your whole mindset changes from me to all the people around me. How are they doing? How are they growing? The better I can help them to be, the better it's going to be for me. There was an element of self-interest. It wasn't purely. So that quote from Jack, I think, is one or two things people should think about, sort of in terms of developing themselves as leaders. It's really, really about how much can you attract and grow the people around you and get them to work together.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you, John. I think you completely validated, what we've learned from you along the years about growing. And there are a couple of takeaways from your answer. The first one is very important, and I think especially young leaders need to understand this: that your leadership learning kit is not just about learning under good managers, but also the via negativa, which they say, learning what to avoid, what you learn from bad managers, and that you need to avoid that in your journey. And we spoke on Mike Neal earlier, and like Mike Neal, there have been so many iconic leaders, John, there. And about the B player C player thing, I think this is perfectly, that was culture in our organization, of course, John. What Steve Jobs famously said, the bozo explosion which happens in most organizations is because B players as leaders hire C players, and C players hire D players, and then we have a company of Z players, and that's how they tank. And so I think that's very important, and you put it so nicely, John. So John, I mean, in the interest of time, let's move to the next question, which is about leadership essentials. As someone who has worked in Western multinationals all my life, and a major portion of which has been with GE, what intrigues me about your career is the non-linearity of your resume. I mean, unlike most Western CEOs, you are someone who's built multiple businesses across different geographies. And having seen you in action from close quarters during your India leg, of course, we would admire your ability to quickly grasp nuances of the new market and apply your leadership successfully on spaces where you had little prior experience in. And in most multi-business conglomerates, we rarely see cross-pollination of leader. I don't know if that's a term, but cross-pollination across businesses between leaders. And that's what leads them to fumble when they deal with unknown unknowns. I mean, COVID-19 is a recent example. We've seen so many leaders flounder when they dealt with an unknown. So my question, therefore, John, to you is, what is your advice to someone who wishes to build a strong career in a multi-business conglomerate? What is more important? Is it domain expertise or is it agility?
Well, we can talk more about the future of multi-business conglomerates, and GE obviously has been going through some transformations there. And for a lot of reasons, I think, the future of conglomerates is somewhat limited probably. But I think at the part of your question is, I think of it on two dimensions. One is, you have to be good at something. You can't be a pure generalist, but if you can establish some competencies, proven, success in a certain thing, then you may be able to leverage that into something that's broader. So I grew up in a financial service business. I think I was able to display, good decision making, good risk management, things that really matter to a financial service company. So I got to a base level of he's good at that, clearly. And that was really built on domain expertise. Maybe he might be good at some other things. Maybe I can imagine, from the first point to the second. But you have to get to the first point. So I think that some domain or some functional expertise or something that sort of establishes your competency is essential. And at a sort of tactical level, that domain is super important. So if you're selling MRI machines or gas turbines or whatever, you need to know, what you're talking about. And I used to go in on like Saturday mornings, and you guys, Kishore, Depeche would be like explaining to me, here's how, combined cycle power plant works or whatever. I was trying to figure that out, but you were so involved, John. I mean, in the Reliance project, I remember you were almost, you were barely the CEO. You were part of the sales team. I mean, you sold $1 billion project. Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted. I remember riding around with Kishore in Mumbai trying to, get the Reliance guys. But at a leadership level, that technical competency is not really essential, because the things that are sort of broader at a leadership level, I think, do transcend multiple types of business. Can you set strategy? Can you build a team and a culture? How are you allocating resources? How do you drive accountability? how do you set up an environment where a team wants to win? And, part of my experience over time was different businesses, different geographies, all those things. Those things were common everywhere. Every team wanted to win. Every team wanted to know where we're going. Every team wanted to know, how do I fit in? What's important? How can I contribute to winning? And I found that to be extremely transferable. So, I'd get into these jobs where India is a perfect example. You easily could have said, hey, profile for India leader is somebody deeply experienced and connected in India and fully understands the industrial businesses of GE. And I would have been like last on the list of both of those things. So, but some of those other aspects of the job, I had developed some capability at, in other jobs at GE. So it was fun to try different things like that.
No, but I think, it's not just you learned the domain things, and that's probably, I'll come to that. But I remember that you had actually put in specific efforts to understand the cultural nuances. I remember you getting interested in cricket, and you used to ask questions to us during our weekly meetings about cricket, because you wanted to, have that cricket tribal knowledge to hold, conversations with business leaders, because you knew cricket
essential.
India, yeah. So we remember that. Great.
I remember that the time that India played Pakistan, I think it was 2011, probably, in the World Cup, in the I think it was quarterfinals, and just giving everybody the day off, because I was like, people aren't going to be paying attention to work anyway, so I might as well,
Yes.
So my popularity spiked that one day when I said, hey, why don't you guys, everybody go home and let's watch the match.
And India won the World Cup in 2008.
They did.
Yeah, so we did win the World Cup, and it was a big moment, and it was a big. I remember that you had announced a holiday for the team for that, so it was great. So thanks, John. So wonderfully put. I think, John, that's what is probably essential in terms of the serendipity part of it is partial, but you also need to take personal accountability in terms of when you get into unknown spaces and learn from there. So which brings me, John, to a very interesting and emotional topic, which is like turnarounds. Your career is a rare combination of building new businesses as well as turning around underperforming businesses into great assets. And while both these situations call for exemplary leadership, no doubt about that. But I'd like to understand your approach to turnarounds, because whether it was during your G Capital days, and we just spoke about it when you went to Japan, when other capital companies were growing at like 30-40%, we were growing at a very low rate, and how you conservatively stepped it up and turned it around. And when you led the first massive experiment of building a mini GE in India, and you put GE India right on the map. And even later, during your very, very celebrated healthcare stint, where you turned around GE Healthcare, and then your successful stint as a M&A leader for General Electric Company before you eventually took the top job at GE. So what's your broad playbook when you need to turn around a business? Obviously, I mean, I understand that these are all very different assignments and each call for very unique strategic thinking, but are there any common denominators about turnarounds of a business at a top leadership level?
So I think, if we go back to the earlier Jack comment, first and foremost, any of those assignments and outcomes were the product of a large team sort of getting their arms around the issues. And so it's definitely not a singular, I did this or I did that, et cetera. So the team thing's super essential. But I think in terms of the way that I behaved or thought about them at the time, there are definitely some commonalities in each one of them. The first, I would say, is like getting grounded in reality, like what is really going on here. And that was fundamentally for me, first and foremost, getting grounded in the marketplace and the customers. So I didn't really start with like inside the company, what's right or wrong. I started outside the company. What are customers saying? What do they want? How do they feel about us? How do they feel about competitors? And that inevitably really dialed in very quickly what was good about a business and what were challenges about a business. So that would be rule number one, is you got to get grounded in reality, and the reality is outside the company, not inside the company. So I would always start there.
External focus.
The second thing was, from that exercise, then I'd go internal. What's holding us back? Why can't we be as good as Reliance is at something? Or what are the issues? Is it people issues? Is it technology issues? Is it amount of resources? Is it org structure? There's something embedded that is holding back our potential? And so, like, for example, in the healthcare business, when I got there, we had amazing technology, incredible global footprint, sales and service distribution all around the world, like so many strengths. But the business wasn't growing. It wasn't tanking, but it wasn't growing. And for a while, I was like, why is this not doing better, basically? And in my first several weeks, I met with a lot of customers. And, my internal team was like, hey, everything's great. Everything's fine. We have the best technology, all the reasons why, we have a great business. And I would listen to them and be like, that all makes sense to me, but we're not growing. So something's not right here exactly. And the customers just, a few of them were quite positive. Most of them really crushed me with feedback. And the core of the feedback was around our customer mindset, our sort of arrogance, our lack of service mentality, lack of understanding their life, and their problems. And so that would be the second step, is like, what is the fundamental cause of the gap? And then the other couple of things I would say, getting the right team in place. So very frequently, once you kind of did that diagnostic of marketplace, what's holding us back, the answer frequently was some changes in the team, either their mindset or literally the people. And then the last thing I'd say, Ayon, is maybe redefining success, recasting sort of aspirations. This is what we can be. We're this, but we can be that. And trying to get people to think on a different plane, or a higher plane, or a more aspirational plane. And I remember being in India, and one of the first meetings I had was with our water. We had a water treatment business at the time. And we went through the presentation, and the person was like, listen, we grew our sales last year, 42%. And it's the highest growth rate globally for GE. And the sales had gone from like 20 to 33 or something. And I was like, that's a good percentage, but this should be like a $500 million business. Like, we're in India, and water infrastructure and is like a super huge issue. We shouldn't be happy with 20 to 33. We should be like, why can't we be 500? And the market's that big. And I remember they were sort of bummed out a little bit, of like, where I was expecting a big compliment for my 42% increase. And so getting people to, rethink what we can be and should be was a part of it. And lastly, just what we talked about before, is that people want to win. They want to know, how do you define winning? How do they contribute to that? And in every one of those circumstances, people got motivated by that, and so that's universal, that desire to win. And when people, whether it's cricket or business or whatever, when you lay out like, hey, if we do X, Y, and Z, we're going to be, the World Cup champs, that works in business as well as it does in sports.
Fantastic, John. I think, that there are some great examples you gave, and I could relate to a couple of them definitely. Because the water business example, I remember you had actually mentioned this during one of our meetings. And in fact, the person who leads the water business for Veolia, which is the GE water business today in South Asia, Gopal, I think he's on the show. He's probably one of the participants. He's a big fan of yours. And so that was one. And Ajay, I don't know if you remember Ajay Kumar. Ajay was our C&I leader. Ajay was my boss when I was doing my ECLP program. And I remember, there was a town hall we had done when the C&I business was a fledgling, slow, kind of, struggling business. and you came in and you delivered a keynote during our annual meeting, and people got so fired up, and we clocked our best numbers that year. I remember that was 2009, if I'm not mistaken, 2009 end. So yeah, so I think it's all about changing the paradigm, which you said very correctly, and that's what leaders need to do, and we've learned so much from you on that, John. So that's very well put, John. Thank you, John. So that brings me to probably the next aspect of leadership, which is like decision making. As someone who's reached the highest possible office in one of the most competitive and the most admired organizations in the world, decision making obviously comes with the territory. When one studies your career in retrospect, we see so many significant decisions that you made at various points in your career. One thing that I personally am a big fan of, and I mentioned this to you off stage, that is the speed and simplicity with which you would make very complex decisions. Because those decisions, when they were made, they seemed like they are simple decisions, but when you join back the dots, they were very complicated decisions. So my question is, are great leaders born decisive, or is it a learned skill? Or in other words, how much of decision making is instinct and how much of it is practice? And if it is practice, how does someone hone their decision making skills? And there is a supplementary question to that. As a leader, there are chances that we can make wrong decisions. So how does a leader move on after making a wrong decision? So that's on decision making, John. I'd like to hear your views.
Yep. Well, listen, I can certainly talk about making wrong decisions because I've made plenty along the way. I do think it's kind of a learned experience. Some people maybe are innately decisive, but I think it requires practice and sort of conscious application. But I would go to a few things, Ayon. One is, I'll put in my plug for liberal arts. I had a liberal arts undergraduate degree. I felt like that ended up helping my decision making unbelievably, because the essence of an essay or a thought in liberal arts is like, hey, you have to distill this down to like 2 or 3 things. I can remember writing an English paper sometime in college. It'd be 3 pages. The next assignment is, okay, write the same thing in 1 page. The next assignment would be write it in half a page. The next assignment would be write it in 1 paragraph. And you were just like distilling to like, this is basically what matters here. And that same mindset on complex decisions was, listen, there's 100 factors to this thing, but like 2 or 3 of them are really going to make all of the difference. And that allowed you to go faster. You're like, I don't have to make 100 decisions here. I have to make 2. And, the rest, if I'm sort of right on those 2, we'll be okay. If I'm wrong on those 2, we're going to have a problem. And so it would allow you to reduce the cycle time dramatically to, I'm only going to focus on a couple of key aspects. So I think that was one thing, is trying to distill the box of decision making to a small one that you can focus on. The second thing is, and I got plenty of criticism for not being decisive enough. My boss Jeff.
That's unfair. Anyway, that's unfair. I think you were very decisive and very fast. But anyway, sorry.
Well, I got plenty of that from my prior boss in his book, but I was pretty deliberate about decision making. Also, was like, I wanted to be grounded in things.
Just a quick one on that.
Yep.
On Mr. Immel's book, I think while he says that, but I also saw an interview by him on CNBC where he said that it's the most difficult person to talk about in my book was John, because I left him with a bunch of problems, which is, in all fairness, it's not his earned problems. I mean, they are my problems, which I left for him. So
yeah. Well, I think he was accurate to say that I did a lot of analysis. Like, part of me making decisions was getting to a level of sort of knowledge where I'm like, I know enough, I'm confident enough to like bet right now of like, I might not know 100% of everything, but I've crossed some mental threshold of like, I know enough to go ahead. And if it was a really major decision and I didn't feel like I was at that threshold, I didn't just make a decision just because like, hey, I want to just show I'm decisive. So let me just shoot out a decision here.
Oh, sure.
And so I did try to be, oriented to making decisions, but oriented to how can I get my comfort level high enough, fast enough to make them quickly. The third thing was financial services was a great, in hindsight, business for decision making. It is a constant, every day, all day, several times a day, you're making, go, no go decisions. Make this loan, don't make this loan. Make this investment, don't make this investment. Sell this asset, don't sell this asset. Sell it for this much or this. You're constantly just sort of yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, just almost subliminally. You're not even really thinking about it, but it's the essence of the job is a battery of decisions all day long. So that was, in hindsight, a great place to practice. And then the last point you raised around making, mistakes and et cetera. Decisiveness is rooted ultimately, I think, in self-confidence. And self-confidence is rooted in like being right most of the time, enough of the time. It's not about being perfect. And you're not going to be right all the time. And if you have that mindset of like, I have to be right all the time because I cannot sustain a mistake, or my career can't sustain a mistake, or I'll never be able to explain that, that's when you start to paralyze of like, because no one can achieve that. So you have to have the self-confidence to say, hey, if I'm right, sort of more often than not, and especially on the big decisions, that's going to be a winning formula. And a few of them will be, clunkers. I made a few like just bad decisions, but we were right more often than not. And then the last thing I'd say, back to this whole team thing, is I would rely very heavily on the team. Like, what do you think about this? What about, and one of the things I would do in particular is say, all right, listen, we're about to make a major decision. We're going to go down this path, not that path. Everybody in the room seems to be saying, yeah, let's go down this path. And I think we should go down this path. But I'm not sure if you guys want to go down this path because you want to go down this path or because you think I want to and you don't want to like dispute that with me. And I would turn to the room and say, okay, somebody, Ayon, Kishore, whoever, make the argument right now that going down this path is the worst idea we have ever had and, could think of. And that got a lot of dialogue going because people who might not have said, hey, I'm not so sure about this, would say, well, listen, if you make me make the argument, here are the three things that we should, maybe why we should consider this. And every once in a while, that exercise would be like, you know what, the more we sort of think about it that way, maybe we should come to a different decision. So you're trying to get the power of a group's perspective, particularly to your earlier point where I'm not steeped in an industry forever, the people around me are, it'd be sort of crazy not to harness their decision-making power.
Yeah. I think pre-mortem, which you just said, doing a pre-mortem and assuming that I make a decision and 1 year down the line, what happens if this decision turns out to be a wrong one? And, the problem today, the decision paralysis that you mentioned, John, is that I see it often because I am a student of organizational leadership and I try to write about that. I see decision paralysis is because people generally try to avoid making wrong. They play to not lose rather than playing to win. And we've all grown up on, and we spoke about Welsh earlier because, I remember a line I'm paraphrasing, I'm not exactly, but it's paraphrasing. He had said that I'm in a flight from US to London, and in the flight, I need to make, say, 100 decisions. And I need to make sure that I make 80 right decisions and 20 wrong. I don't care because, but it should not be that when I land, I have not made any of those decisions. That's what leadership is about. You need to make those decisions, make the calls. And I think that's where the paralysis has happened today. People just don't decide. And, you put it so nicely, John, and I think that's also about communicating how you are deciding. And that kind of very nicely segues into my next question to you is on communication, John, because I always believe that the most important personality trait of an effective leader is communication skills. And we've seen how amazing you are at it. I mean, I remember those 10-minute videos of yours every Friday when you were the CEO, where you would break down all that was happening around the giant conglomerate into simple bites that could be understood and assimilated by even the last person in the chain. And personally, for me, what made those videos so great was your conversational style and your non-intimidating way of looking into the camera and making us all feel as if you were one among us instead of a distant leader sitting in a distant country somewhere. And like I said, as an observer of organizational leadership, I feel that every organizational failure starts with a leader failing to communicate the right message to the right audience. Because today we have, thanks to technology, we have so many tools and tackles and apps and social media. And yet, despite having all that, I see so many, most leaders, I will say 80% leaders, fail to deliver effective messages to their troops. So my question to you, John, is what advice do you have for leaders who wish to become effective communicators like what you are?
So I don't know how effective I ultimately was, and I learned things over time. But the first thing I would say, Ayon, in communications is authenticity is the absolute linchpin of communication. And organizations are incredibly smart and savvy about seeing and feeling authenticity. And it's sort of binary. They look at a communication and a leader and sort of say, it's a 0 or a 1. That's that real person communicating with me, and I can kind of picture that person, and I can picture having a beer with that person or whatever. Or that is a curated message coming out of some, process, and I don't know if that reflects the person. So getting people to feel like they know you's like ground zero, and being comfortable enough in your, with yourself to allow that to happen is important. The second thing, the funny thing about those videos is it was rooted in my time in healthcare. So when I was in healthcare, again, some of these customer, visits, and the customers are complaining about this or that or whatever, I'd go back to our communications people and I'd be like, I want to transmit like absolutely real time to people. Like, can't I just make a video on my phone and say, guys, this is my third customer visit today. I'm in a cab in New York City, and they all have said, bang, 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 we have to get better at, this, and just hit send. So I was like, no editing, no nothing, no, banner or overhead. It's like, hey, I'm in a cab. Here's what's happening right this minute. They're like, no, that's not how we do the communications. It's got to be, more professional than that, if you will. And I was like, listen, I'm pretty sure this would be very effective if they actually felt like he's on his way to the next meeting and here's a report from the ground. So I wanted to do that. And my sort of like handlers in the GE infrastructure, like, that's not how we do it. So one of the benefits of becoming the CEO is you get to do a little more what you want, I guess. So when the GE thing, and all the issues and the crisis came around, I kind of went back to that basic thought process of let's make this personal. Let's not make it feel like it's a fancy, slick message. Because in a crisis, and we were definitely in a crisis, the single largest thing people want to feel is they want to feel informed. Like, people can handle a lot of bad news, but they don't love feeling like, I don't know what the news is, and they're telling me what's going on or not telling me what's going on. They can handle what's going on. So the first thing was, I was comfortable if I explained things simply, like, hey, we have some basic issues here, that people could handle that. But then the second thing is, they're watching you as a leader super carefully of like, listen, this is complicated, but how does John or whomever is making that communication feel? Like, if they seem like they're okay and confident, I feel okay. If they seem like they're nervous or, not being straight with me, it makes 100,000 people nervous. So that authenticity, how they feel, I was really always motivated by like Winston Churchill stories or something in World War II and beginning of World War II when things were not going well, but he's up there like, guys, we're going to get through this thing.
Yes.
And I remember even in my current job, the guy, Mike Che, who runs our firm, is an absolutely fantastic guy and a really strong leader. And the first week of COVID, when we were like, the world stopped, a bunch of our companies had loans and stuff. Everyone's like, oh my God, like the world's going to end. How are we going to pay back the loans? The companies are not open for business. And I remember saying to Mike, like, listen, as you're communicating to the firm, like they're going to watch you so carefully for the subtle signs of, how confident are you? And he did a spectacular job. So he teases me about saying I made him a little stressed out by telling him he was now Winston Churchill. But so that said, a lot of people, including some of the GE board members, they didn't love those messages. They were like, this is a little too informal. It's not, CEO like, et cetera. So not everybody loved them, but it was me. That's what I was comfortable doing at that time.
Amazing. Yeah, of course. And John, you mentioned a great point. And everybody in GE who are your fans agree about the authenticity part of it, because we are talking about the same organization where, again, Jack Welch scribbled on a small notepad in his study, and he faxed it during that Honeywell story, which has become folklore today. And we are talking of that organization where the speed and simplicity and self-confidence, they were the three pillars by which leaders used to, right?
Not a bad summary, right?
Yeah, speed, simplicity, self-confidence. I think that sums it up. And the biggest takeaway from your answer, John, is on the authenticity part of it. And before I get into the larger question on conglomerates, this is not a question, probably this is more of a comment, because this is for maybe people to remind them of your tenure, and also for people who have not been fortunate to work for you. This is a specific anecdote I remember. When there was a leadership town hall, you would probably remember it, John. It had for some reason not gone well, and it was not intentional at all. I mean, it was just there was a conversation which didn't land well, and there was some understandable discontent among the employees, and people had put in, and G being G, we encourage people to be open and candid, and people had commented that they didn't like it. And I remember that how immediately, maybe in a couple of hours, you came out with a video message and you took responsibility for whatever had happened, and you even added that you were new at your job and you were still learning. I have never seen any leader at such a senior position stand up and deliver such a humble and an authentic message. And I recall, how every employee, and there were, like messages going around that everybody had become a fan of your emotional intelligence with that simple gesture of yours. Because all through your career, what I have observed, we've seen you as someone who's very high on emotional intelligence and someone who has this deep people-centric approach to leadership. Even now, when you're talking, there's so many years back, you've been in India, you're mentioning Deepesh, you're mentioning Kishore and names. And, so in an age where most people, by the time they reach mid-management, unfortunately so, and I am so frustrated when I see these people develop these giant egos, they distance themselves from the truth. They feel that it is below their dignity to respond to people. Your humility and empathy is something that every leader should aspire and learn from. Because today, when AI has stepped into mainstream, the only differentiator that is going to differentiate us humans as leaders from machines is our emotional intelligence. So thank you, John. This was more of a thank you for your EI and your empathy lessons that you had given to us. So now let's come to the question on GE. One last question before we take, and there have been a lot of audience questions here. So one last question is that as someone who's led one of the largest conglomerates and the most competitive and successful conglomerates in the world, do you think, and you touched upon it briefly in the first question when you were answering the first question, do you think that the days of the giant Western conglomerate are finally behind us now, given that most large organizations today are breaking up into more focused and smaller entities, including, of course, the GE that you led today is successfully operating as three vibrant and distinct organizations in themselves. So what's your take on conglomerates and their future?
Listen, as a general rule, I think smaller, more focused businesses they just outperform. It's better for the business. It's better for the customers of that business. The focus, the investment, the domain expertise. I think, a better model, and it's better for investors. And investors always used to come to us and say, "Hey, if I want to buy a healthcare company and a bank, I can go buy Medtronic and JP Morgan stock, but or either. You guys make me buy, because it's one giant company. You make me buy an oil and gas business, a power business. Like the investors want to make their own sort of pure play decisions as well. So I think it's better for the business, and I think it's a better orientation for the market. And then lastly, I think it's broadly better for the employees. So we had, in the system in GE, if 4 businesses were doing well and one had a fiasco, everybody paid the price. And over time, that if you were in one of the well-performing businesses, but you weren't getting the benefit of that because some issue somewhere else in the company, it's demotivating. So I had very clear thought from running the healthcare business prior to the CEO job. I had very clear thoughts of like, this business would be way more effective outside of GE. So I wasn't really thinking about breaking up the company then. I was more thinking, this business, when I compare that healthcare business to our competitors, it's structurally disadvantaged. We don't have our own currency to make acquisitions. Investors are, our benchmark is operating profit growth, whereas the other people are focused on top line growth and investing in technology. Is a completely different metric. Our cash flow gets sent up to the parent company and they pay a giant dividend. Other businesses are investing their cash in technology and acquisitions, and their investors don't want a dividend. So part of me is like, we're playing a completely different game, but we're competing, and this is not going to end well. So I had that thought in my mind of that healthcare could flourish better outside the company than inside the company. And then once I got into the CEO role, within that started in August. By basically Christmas time of that year, December of that year, I wrote a memo, 5 pages, and sent that to the board, ultimately basically advocating that we spin healthcare out, and then some form of separating aviation and power. So I think the teams executed it incredibly well. That idea at the time I proposed it, people hated it. Most employees hated it. Most of the board members hated it. But I was pretty sure it was the right path for GE. And I think that's kind of borne out. And the last thing one of the reasons people hated this at the time was there was a lot of like, how could you do this? How could you even think this? This is a heretical thought that this conglomerate that's been this way for 120 years, like, how can that, and you've been here forever, like you of all people, how can you betray us, basically? How can you even think that? And I remember saying at the time, like, guys, the company in its current form is kind of dying. And for all sorts of reasons and all sorts of circumstances. And this is not like destroying GE. This is sort of like liberating and setting all the pieces free. And I used to use the example of, you have kids, I have kids. Like, hey, at some point, your kids kind of need to go out of the house and be on their own and find their own path forward and have their own sort of opportunities and disappointments. But they're still your kids. They still have all the lessons they learned. They still have your genetic heritage and cultural heritage. And I always felt like, hey, when this actually happens, you're going to get the best of everything. You're going to get all the benefits of being standalone companies. You're still going to have this GE culture. So when I watch people now posting like, hey, today was GE Vernova's first day of trading or whatever it is, and the excitement, like the excitement of like, we love this situation. And, we're still GE, we still love GE, but now we have a different dynamic. I love watching that. So I think it's long-winded answer. This is the right thing to do. And I think almost always in a conglomerate situation, it's probably the right thing to do.
Oh yes, thank you, John. Thanks for the endorsement. And I know that, you know, on the healthcare part which you said, I remember that, you know, at that time there were those intranet messages going around. So I remember, and yes, you are very right. When the spin-off has happened, there was initially this emotional resistance, probably, that how could you do this kind of a question. But people have, the way it has been executed, and I can say this, although I have made a disclaimer that I am not here as a GE employee, I am more on a private capacity, but I have seen it as an industry watcher also, the kind of pride and self-confidence that Vernova employees, at least I have seen Vernova getting spun off. I have not seen the other two entities, but at first hand, there was so much pride and there was so much of, you know, ownership in people, that they were feeling that, you know, we own this. We are startup founders of a new company. And Scott is such a fantastic leader.
He's
and
a great guy. Yeah.
A great leader. And he's made every employee feel that they own part of the picture. You know, that was very important. And like you used to do. I mean, it's unless employees feel they are part of the long-term plan, they don't feel that engagement. And I think in Vernova today, we have so much engagement, and thanks to, you know, what this leadership is. So I think fantastic answer, John. Thanks a lot. So I think there are a lot of questions, John. Let's take some of those questions. So I think Robin is saying that Bragg Hageman asks, how do you grow EQ is in leaders who are completely self-involved?
Wow. First, I would say we just had Father's Day in the U.S. on Sunday. Yeah, whatever I have of EQ, I would say I broadly got from, you know, my parents. You know, just their basic orientation and how do you think about people, and how do you treat people, and how do you treat the, you know, sort of the least powerful people around you, and what does that say about, like, that was a upbringing of mine that I'm super thankful for. You know, I think like any innovation or evolution of a leader, the first step is saying and communicating to people, you know, I want to get better at something, whether if it's EQ or whatever. I want to get better. So people have to believe that you see an issue and want to improve it. And then you get feedback and suggestions, and you practice. Their organizations have huge tolerance for going through that. Okay, there's an issue there. They recognize the issue. They want to correct the issue. They want my input. People will put their shoulder behind somebody trying to do that. So I would say, raise your hand and get feedback and support, and just try it. And, you know, it's like any new skill or changing skill. It's a little, you know, not so easy at first, but with some repetition, you can do it. Anyone can do it, I think.
Super. Thank you. Thanks, John. I think, you know, you remember probably, I don't know if you remember Brad. Brad had made a comment in one of my blog posts, I think, when I had written about you, that the day on your last day at your GE job, I think he had sent you an email, and Brad told me, you know, that John was so humble. He replied to my email, and I was just a far-flung employee somewhere in the organization, and, you know, he replied to my email in person, and, you know, that reflects on whatever you said on EQ. You walk the talk, John. So thanks. So the next one is more of a comment. It's not a question. It is Abhishek is saying, decisiveness has never been explained so succinctly. It is not about taking decisions because people expect you to be decisive, but it is more about doing your own risk assessment first if you have not still reached your own threshold to take the decision. Amazing insights, Mr. Flannery. So that's Abhishek. And now, you know, I'll try to get some of your old troops. So Namrata is saying, you know, you remember Namrata? She was your communication leader in India. Hey, John, This is Namrata. It is so good to see you. And she says that, you know, thanks for organizing this and, you know, coming on this, John. It's a joy listening to you. And he was one of the best CEOs G ever had. And then, you know, we have Ravi Anand. You remember Ravi from
Sure.
the GE? So Ravi is saying it's a privilege, John, to be listening to this interaction. I'm a great fan of yours and have been and felt that your leadership magic. I have felt your leadership magic. I'm sure that Ayon will ask the questions and that we can all relate to. Then, Vaibhav is asking you, in multi-layer and multiple business models, how can we develop ourselves to be a catalyst to adopt the things quickly and build ourselves as per the requirement of as per the leadership requirements of the market?
So that's a great question, actually. And people would always ask me, how do I know if I'm in a good job? How do I get ahead? What do I need to do? So on, are you in a good role or not? One thing I would always say if I was at Crotonville and got that question or something is, if you're working for people, with and for people that you respect, that you trust, you feel like you're learning from, et cetera, you're in a good situation. You like and respect the people you work for, learning rapidly. So that's one. And I would say, like, if you can say yes to those two things, kind of stay the course. If you can say yes to one of the two, maybe examine how you could get to yes on both. If you can't say yes to either one of those things, you're not in a great situation and probably should think about moving. But on the other question of, like, how do you flex and learn and grow and take on other things, kind of by accident, but in hindsight, the picture is there. I took many assignments that other people didn't want. Many things where something was kind of going wrong, or it was an issue for the company in my early days in GE Capital, or it was perceived as risky. I can remember my GE Capital friends when I went to India, they were like, dude, this is like not a good decision. Like, you don't know anything about India. You don't know anything about the industrial business, and they're going to, eat you alive in that job, kind of thing. So I did all these jobs that sort of the conventional wisdom would say, maybe you shouldn't do it. And I developed over that time a saying in my head of, like, okay, the analogy is, if you want to run a race in the middle of the pack, where do you think you're going to finish at the end of that race? You're going to be in the middle of the pack. Like, by definition, if you just sort of stay in this little box, you're going to finish in this little box. And so I think taking on other assignments, taking on challenges, raising your hand to help out on something that, is important to the leadership of your business, you've got to kind of branch out. And that's how you learn new things. That's how you demonstrate capabilities. That's how you get people to sort of see what you're capable of. So those are that question. I love that question. And it's rooted in, don't take the safe route all the time, because it's a kind of a limiting route.
Yeah, I think perfectly. And, Vaibhav, I think that sums up, what John just said, that the GE that we have grown up in was like that, you need to take on new challenges. You may make mistakes, but you learn from them, pick yourself up, and that's how you grow. You cannot be in a status quo and expect that you will grow or the organization will grow. So, the next question, John, and this is one of my favorite topics, and I'd like to understand from you, is that Kabir is saying that it's a privilege to listen to you, John. A question is that, what are the top 3 things you would look at while hiring, especially leadership positions? Would you hire for experience only or for other qualities?
That's a great question. And if you look at classic interviewing and all those things, I'm a terrible interviewer, because but I feel like I have a very high success rate in interviewing. But so all the things they say don't do, like, don't form an opinion in the first 5 minutes. Don't, really ask sort of complex questions and demonstrate this, like, really pick them apart during the interview. I never did that. I would just sort of, cruise around their resume and tell me where you grew up, and tell me, did you see the, cricket last night? And I would start in the first 5 or 10 minutes. This is especially for leadership jobs, to be like, I kind of have a feel for what this personality is like. And it might be like a strong ego, command and control personality, or a smart and humble thing. Like I would get that. That's what I would. So I really looked for what's their core personality. You obviously look for track record. So as part of that conversation, if people have a strong track record, it comes out. And then the last thing, you kind of fuse those two together. I would always be asking about, how do you lead teams? How do you, what's your rhythm for meeting with your team? How many people did you change on your team? How many, if I was interviewing from someone from outside the company, I would ask them, hey, if we hire you, how many people from your team would come follow you? And so that followership was like a giant, message to me, because some people would be like, I don't know. And other people would be like, they all would, the other company might be, not happy. But so those were the kind of things: core personality, track record, how they led. And again, a classic HR person would say, usually 15 minutes into the interview, I was certain in my mind, this is a yes or a no, which is like breaks every rule of interviewing.
So well said, John. And I completely identify with it, because I have seen you in person. And I remember, the first time I met you, I was just fresh and green out of my leadership program. And you asked me that, what's your opinion about, that's the first question you asked me. What's your opinion about this leadership program? Is it good, bad, good plus? So I said, it's good plus. And you just, kind of grinned and you said, okay, I get it. So, I could understand later that you were just sizing me up, how much of me is just leadership program and how much is horse sense. So, we get that, John. John, I think we are up on time, but there are a few more questions. Would you have a few more minutes to take the questions?
Sure.
Okay, so very quickly, one by one. So Rituja is saying that it's a privilege to get to be listening to you speak today. Decision-making, authenticity, communication, all great things to keep in mind. Is there one undeniable nugget or advice you would encourage the next generation of CEOs to carry with them always?
One nugget. I'm thinking of a word right now. I'm thinking of the word curiosity, because I think if I had to distill like 100 ideas into a word, I might pick that word. Embedded in that word is, I don't take anything for granted. I don't take the status quo for granted. I don't take that what worked yesterday is going to keep working. I don't sort of look past things that are going on in the marketplace. I'm curious what customers think. I want to know how our employees feel. So that mindset of like, I don't know everything in many ways, and everything's changing anyway. So even if I did know everything within the passage of a short period of time, it's going to be stale. All the thing, AI, how these things are changing. Like, I think if you're innately curious, you're sort of constantly learning and evolving. And, there's other important things, but if I had to pick one that sort of sustains you for a long time, that'd probably be a word I would gravitate to.
Of course, curiosity is definitely, and to keeping yourself curious and open to new things is probably what keeps us relevant. And John, we've learned this so much from you. There are other comments, I'm not taking there are questions like Rajiv is saying, fantastic session, Rajiv Mukherjee. Amitava Goswami is saying, very enriching session, John. There is one question I wanted, just Abhijit Majumdar is asking you, thank you for sharing your valuable experience, John. My question is, what has been your North Star? Was it excellence or perfection? And I think you answered it partly in all your endeavors, that perfection is probably overrated. You said that it's probably more excellent.
Yeah. My North Star at the end is winning. So I'm not an aggressive person or personality, I wouldn't say, but I'm incredibly competitive. And so under the surface of some of my surface is like the competitiveness. Like we have to win. Like our business has to win in the marketplace. Our segment should be the best segment in GE. my little P&L should be the best one inside my, like I always had that, anxiety motivation of like, I want to win. I just want to win. I want to keep winning. And that, that sort of motivation, and again, sports is not a perfect analogy for everything, but I think it's very drawn from playing sports and stuff when I was a kid. It's, it keeps you moving forward. It keeps you, even after you've won, I remember the healthcare business won the Business of Year award or whatever. And that January 3rd, we had our kickoff meeting. I was like, we got to win this again. Like we, don't take any, sort of victory lap. Like we have to win again kind of thing. And so that was the one thing that kept me going. And it's also the thing that I think organizations fundamentally in their totality want exactly the same thing. Where are we going? How do I contribute? We want to win. And that is the most gratifying thing. When we won this Business of the Year award, it was at the end of 2016, and we were in Boca where GE had their annual meeting. And we had a reception sort of after that, a little like cocktail hour for the healthcare people. And there were probably like 50 of them at that Boca meeting. And I remember just leaning against the wall, kind of by myself a bit, sipping a beer and just watching the team. They're high-fiving each other. They're hugging each other. They're so happy that they won. And, at that moment, they didn't care about their title or their compensation even. And as a leader, I was like, wow, this is a privilege, but like so energizing to watch people win.
Totally, John. I could totally visualize the scene that you explained. And, for the non-GE folks who are on the show, I mean, what John just said is the DNA that, we've grown up on, as youngsters who came to GE as the most aspirational organization for us during our generation, at least, was this intrinsic desire to win. GE people never gave up. We might not have been the best in everything, but there was this intrinsic desire to win, which, kept GE moving ahead of others. And I think, John just put it so nicely. So John, just one last question. I know we are running out of time. So, Anupama asks you that it's a privilege to listen to you, John. A lot of lessons here from each of us. My question to you is, Jensen, the CEO of Nvidia, has said that he believes in a flat organization, lesser hierarchy, and he has 60 direct reports himself. Would love to know your take on his style of leadership. I mean, this is a very personal question, so you can choose if you don't want to answer it, John. And
No, I love it. I would very much embrace that mindset. I think, rooted in the breakup and spinoff of GE was a lot of that. We had tons of layers, tons of overhead, if you will, tons of decision-making layers, at the central thing. So that idea of flattening an organization, driving ownership down a level, driving decision-making down, driving accountability down, and really focusing on, hey, I have great people at that level and very few people in between myself in that level is, I think, absolutely the way to go.
I completely agree. And, boundarylessness is one of our key aspects, what we grew up in GE, John, and you've taught us that. So decision making, and, the whole India experiment which you led was all about minimizing the bureaucracy, which happened in India. And that's where, during your stint, I think GE India touched numbers that we never hit even till today. So, and especially I remember the energy business, we had hit $1 billion that year in 2010, 11.
Yeah.
So it's like crazy. I mean, that number I can't even imagine, in today's world. So I think that was very much to do with decision making, because I remember when we were talking of that Reliance project, John, I remember it was nothing to do with outside India. Everything was the buck stopped at you. So, that's how decision making becomes simplified, and, that's how people win in the market, I think, So you said it so well, John. Thanks a lot. So I think
that's a credit to my bosses at the time. Jeff Immel put me in that position with that kind of structure, and Mike Neal did the same in GE Capital. So you need somebody to set up that dynamic for you.
True. And I hope other leaders listening to this podcast will also take a leaf out of your book, John, that leadership is like where we began this conversation today, that till a certain point, it's about yourself. But once you become a leader, it's about growing more people. And thank you, John, because, I will end on a personal note. John, this is a personal thank you to you. I remember in 2011, I was a little disillusioned because I was this high-performing, high-octane sales director in gas, and we had just done $1 billion, and then India ran out of gas because we stopped regulation, gas, etc. And I said that I wanted to leave the organization and go outside. And I remember, John, you didn't even probably know me in person at that time. I remember you set up time with HR, with Vishal and the HR, etc. And Pratt was also there. Pratt had worked. Remember Pratt, right? So, and you said that, get this guy some role within G. This guy should not leave G. And they gave me an offer to lead the battery business, which was Imel's project at that time. So I was so grateful at your gesture, John, because you didn't have to do that. Of course, that was not part. I contributed nothing. I mean, if I was gone, anybody can come in and do it. But I was so grateful about that. And years later, when I thought you'd probably have forgotten me when I was writing my second book, I sent a note to you that, John, would you mind writing a small two-liner for my cover page? And you responded immediately within a day, and you sent me that message. Maybe for you, it was probably just another thing as a leader, but for me, it was a very, very, very emotional moment. And I wanted to thank you for that, John. And we have very few leaders like you, John, today. And I really thank you for all the learnings from you. And as your followers, we try to pass on the learning that we've learned from you to the next generation. And these podcasts or these blogs or books that I'm trying to do is just to carry on the legacy which we've learned from you, John. So thank you, John. Thanks for taking time out.
Well, not my pleasure. And I do think, wrapping up on that point, Ayon, that whole notion of caring about people, developing people, all the things we talked about, that is the number one message. There was a question about far-flung employees or something. Like, there is no far-flung employee. Like, every single person matters. If you're leading and trying to develop as a leader, you have to be thinking, about harnessing all the people and getting them, treating them with respect and motivating. So I'm psyched that you're doing these podcasts, and hopefully people can pick up a learning or two. And I don't know how much you're filtering the questions there, Ayon, but I am surprised I didn't get a question about curd rice from some of my friends in India who used to be always confused about why I liked it so much, but I did.
There are so many questions, John, but I actually, the thing is, I can't filter out which are comments and which are general questions. So Nilesh is saying, for example, there's a great session. Battery of decisions, emotional intelligence, and curiosity are my key takeaways here. And Rituja is again saying awesome advice. Thank you, Mr. Flannery. Namrata is again, saying thanks to you. Shubro is saying taking up any challenge is my greatest takeaway from this session. Ravi is again thanking you. So, John, there are a lot of comments, and you have got a big fan following across the world, not just among G employees, but even outside. So we continue to learn from you, John, and we expect to see more of you, John, in the public space, because the business world needs more of these candid conversations, and we need young leaders, probably the next generation, the millennials and the Gen X's, Gen Z's need to learn more about the old school leadership which worked, and we need like you to come in and talk to us, sir.
Awesome. Well, listen, I look forward to getting back. I haven't been to India for about 5 years now, so I'm long overdue for a visit, and it would be great to see you guys on the ground.
Absolutely, John, and most welcome. All right. I'll be very happy to host you. Thank you, John. Thanks for taking time out. Have a great day.
Take care.
Thank you. Thanks.
See you guys.
For joining in.
Thank you.